You didn't click this by accident, and you didn't arrive here early.
Something in you has already moved, quietly.
Without asking for permission. Not forward, not upward.
Just out of the way, and that's why this feels familiar before it makes sense.
There's a strange quality to moments like this. Not dramatic, not intense, almost empty. Life hasn't collapsed, nothing has exploded into clarity. And yet, something that used to hold tension doesn't anymore. You may have noticed it as stillness, or neutrality, or the absence of urgency where urgency used to live. Not peace exactly, just the end of strain. This isn't about becoming someone new, it's about noticing that something old stopped trying to run the show. And you didn't announce it. You didn't celebrate it, you may not have even named it. But it's already done. At some point, without marking the date, you stopped watching yourself from the outside. You stopped asking, am I doing this right? Stopped scanning for signs. Stopped bracing for the next correction. And instead there was space. Not filled with answers, just space. That's usually when people think nothing is happening. But this phase doesn't feel like progress. It feels like neutrality. Like standing in a room after the noise has ended, but before you've realized it's quiet. If you've been feeling oddly unmotivated by things that used to matter, if goals feel strangely hollow but not disappointing, if your thoughts have slowed without effort, that's not confusion, that's orientation changing. And orientation changes don't announce themselves. They remove pressure first. There's a moment, often overlooked, where observation stops being a role, where you're no longer standing back, analyzing experience, interpreting yourself, translating life into meaning. You're just here, and nothing feels urgent enough to pull you out of it. Not because you've transcended anything, but because the part of you that needed to comment has stepped aside. Around now, people often say things like, I feel disconnected but not lost. I'm calm but not excited. I don't know what I want anymore, and that doesn't bother me. That's not emptiness. That's the end of commentary. What's interesting is that this phase rarely lasts the way people expect, not because it ends suddenly, but because something else starts quietly forming underneath it, and most people miss that part. You may notice time feels different lately. Not slower, not faster, just less demanding. Deadlines don't grip the same way. The future doesn't pull as hard. The past doesn't echo as loudly. It's not that you've detached from life. It's that life has stopped arguing with you. There's a subtle shift when perception stops needing reinforcement. When you're no longer checking whether your inner experience matches an external script, you stop asking, should I feel more? Should I be doing something? Is this normal? Those questions don't get answered. They dissolve, and that dissolution feels like nothing, which is why it's so often misunderstood. This isn't withdrawal, it's integration. Not integration of information, but of identity. The version of you that needed to watch, measure, and interpret has finished its task. It gathered enough, and now it's quiet. Every identity has a phase where it observes itself. That phase exists for calibration, to learn contrast, to understand texture, to feel difference. But observation isn't meant to be permanent. At some point, awareness stops standing outside the experience and steps back into it. Not dramatically, not consciously, just naturally. You didn't fail at searching. You completed it. That's why searching feels pointless now. Nothing is missing here. There's just less noise pretending to be direction. If you've been waiting for a sign, you may notice how little you care about signs lately. Not cynicism, not disbelief, just neutrality. As if the part of you that needed reassurance already received it, long ago, and you're only now noticing the silence it left behind. This is usually where people feel suspended, like they're between chapters, but the next page hasn't appeared. They call it stagnation, but stagnation feels heavy. This feels light, unclaimed, undecided, which is exactly what it needs to be. When alignment replaces effort, it doesn't arrive with instructions. It arrives as absence. The absence of push, the absence of resistance, the absence of inner negotiation. And without those signals, the mind assumes something is wrong, because it learned to measure progress through tension. But reflection doesn't need force. A mirror doesn't strain to reflect. It just does. And when identity shifts into that role, experience reorganizes on its own timing. You might notice that choices feel quieter now, not fewer. just less dramatic. You don't debate as long. You don't overthink consequences. You don't need certainty to move. Or you don't move at all, and that feels equally valid. This phase doesn't rush. It doesn't chase outcomes. It lets reality come closer before responding, which can feel like waiting, but it isn't. Stillness isn't pause. It's recalibration without commentary. There's a reason this happens collectively, even though it feels personal. Not everyone is aware of it. Not everyone notices the same way. But many people are entering a quieter relationship with themselves at once, not through belief, through exhaustion of old roles. The observer role exists to protect, to interpret, to prepare, to anticipate. But once enough contrast is gathered, protection becomes unnecessary, and awareness relaxes, not into sleep, into presence. You may have realized you're less interested in being understood, not isolated, just complete, as if something inside you stopped needing validation. That doesn't make you distant, it makes you stable. There's a reason this phase feels incomplete when you try to name it, and it has nothing to do with clarity. It has to do with timing. Some recognitions don't reveal themselves until they're already shaping your path. People often assume awakening feels like expansion, but often it feels like subtraction. Less inner dialogue, less urgency, less need to define, which is why it's easy to overlook. You're not gaining something. You're no longer compensating for something that's gone. Suffering isn't punishment, it's misalignment trying to speak. And when alignment returns, suffering doesn't announce its departure. It just stops knocking. If you listen closely, not with effort, but with openness, you may notice that reality has been responding differently lately. Not dramatically, just smoothly. Conversations flow without effort. Situations resolve without struggle. Delays don't sting the same way. It's not luck, it's reflection, adjusting to a quieter signal. When the signal stabilizes, the mirror doesn't need correction. At this point, many people try to do something with this feeling. They look for frameworks, explanations, next steps. But this phase doesn't reward action. It responds to allowance. And allowance feels passive to a mind trained on effort. You may have noticed that your sense of self is less rigid now. You're not clinging to labels, not defending positions, not attached to outcomes, not because you're detached from life, but because identity loosened its grip. This is where parallel versions of self quietly reorganize, not as fantasy, as probability. When resistance fades, paths don't need to be chosen, they surface, and you recognize them not by excitement, but by ease. Time behaves differently here, not linear, not cyclical, responsive. Moments arrive when they're needed, not when they're demanded. If you felt strangely uninterested in forcing change lately, if motivation comes and goes without panic, if you trust timing more than planning, that's not complacency, that's coherence. Effort fades when alignment speaks first. There's a quiet dignity to this phase. No announcements, no identity shift on display, no story to tell others. It's internal, private, almost invisible, which is why it's stable. This is often when people rediscover things they loved before trying to become someone. Simple interests, gentle curiosities, unforced impulses, not as goals, as reflections. You might notice how little you need to convince yourself now. Beliefs don't feel necessary. Perception feels enough. What comes after this isn't louder, it's clearer, and clarity doesn't rush its arrival. If you've come across the idea of parallel realities before, you may notice how differently it lands now. Not as a concept, as recognition, as if it's describing something you've already felt but never articulated. Some things don't teach, they resonate. Recognition doesn't demand agreement. It settles quietly when it's true. The observer phase exists so awareness can learn contrast, but contrast is finite. Once enough is gathered, observation becomes unnecessary. And awareness returns to participation, not blindly, gently. You're not meant to stay suspended, but suspension isn't delay. It's alignment finishing its last adjustments. If you reflect, gently, without searching, you may realize that you're already moving differently. Not faster, not slower, more honestly. This isn't about becoming better. It's about becoming unguarded, and unguarded awareness doesn't need explanation. The video doesn't end here. Not really, because this isn't information. It's resonance, and resonance continues after sound stops. You may notice later today or tomorrow a subtle sense of familiarity returning, not with this video, with yourself, and you won't need to name it. You'll just recognize the quiet where effort used to be, and understand without words that nothing is missing, only something unnecessary has finished, and that was enough. There's a moment when you realize you're no longer trying to figure yourself out, not because you've solved anything, but because the question lost its charge. You still think, you still notice, but there's no pressure behind it. It's like checking the sky without needing to predict the weather. And that's when people start saying, I feel off, but it's not off, it's unfamiliar calm. You might notice how certain emotional reactions simply don't arrive anymore, not healed, not processed, just absent. Things that once triggered a spiral now pass like background noise. You notice them, then they move on. No story follows, and the mind doesn't know what to do with that. The observer phase teaches you to watch yourself, to reflect, to evaluate, to learn. But it was never meant to become your home. It was a bridge, and bridges don't announce when you've crossed them. They're quiet places you only notice when you're already on the other side. If you've felt strangely uninterested in improving yourself lately, that's not stagnation. Improvement requires tension. This phase removes it. You're not trying to become anything. You're letting perception settle. There's often a subtle grief here, not for what you lost, for what no longer feels necessary. Old desires, old ambitions, old fears that once defined direction. They don't hurt. They just don't matter. When identity loosens, importance reorganizes on its own. You may have noticed fewer internal debates, less bargaining with yourself. Decisions don't feel heroic anymore. They feel ordinary. And ordinary feels strangely profound after years of intensity. This is where people mistake quiet for emptiness, because they're used to measuring aliveness through friction. But friction was never life. It was resistance. Awareness doesn't need stimulation to exist. It needs coherence, and coherence feels like simplicity. You might find yourself drawn to still moments now, not because you're tired, but because noise no longer feeds anything. Silence doesn't feel lonely. It feels accurate. There's a reason this phase rarely comes with excitement. Excitement pulls attention outward. This phase brings it home. Not dramatically, gently. If you pause for a second, not to analyze, just to notice, you may realize something subtle. You're no longer watching life to see what it means about you. You're just living inside it. And that's when reality begins responding differently, not because you changed it, but because the signal stopped fluctuating. When perception stabilizes, reflection sharpens. Things arrive with less resistance. Opportunities don't feel chased. They feel encountered. The mirror adjusts when the signal stops arguing. There's nothing to do with this phase, and that's the point. Anything you try to use it for pulls you back into effort. This phase completes itself by being allowed. You may notice an unfamiliar trust forming, not belief, not certainty, just a quiet assumption that things don't need to be forced anymore. That trust didn't come from learning something new. It came from exhausting an old way of holding yourself together. And exhaustion isn't failure, it's completion. At some point you notice something subtle. Life hasn't changed, but the way it answers you has. Not faster, not louder, cleaner. Situations don't cling the way they used to. Conversations resolve without effort. Delays don't feel personal. Outcomes don't feel loaded with meaning. You still care, just not desperately. And that difference matters more than it seems. This is usually when people say, I feel like I'm floating, but floating isn't accurate. Floating suggests detachment. This is contact without resistance. You're no longer leaning into life, trying to make it confirm who you are. And because of that, it reflects you more precisely, not as reward, as alignment. There's a quiet intelligence in this phase. It doesn't push, it doesn't rush, it doesn't demand proof. It waits for coherence before moving. And coherence doesn't come from effort. It comes from stopping the inner argument. You might notice that your sense of time has softened. You don't feel late. You don't feel ahead. You feel placed, as if moments arrive exactly when they're meant to, not because they were scheduled, but because you were ready. This is where paths begin to appear without being chosen. Not dramatic forks in the road, just gentle openings. An invitation here, a curiosity there. A conversation that changes something without trying to. And you don't jump at them. You don't chase, you recognize. When resistance fades, recognition replaces decision. Identity behaves differently here. You're less interested in defining yourself, less attached to consistency. You don't need to be the same person across every context anymore. You're responsive, not rigid, and that flexibility doesn't feel unstable. It feels honest. This is where parallel versions of you stop competing. Not because one wins, because they no longer need to. What aligns moves forward. What doesn't quietly dissolves. No drama, no collapse, just reorganization. You may have noticed that fear doesn't grip the same way. It still appears, but it doesn't direct. It speaks once, then waits, and often it fades before being answered. That's not courage. That's relevance shifting. Fear loses authority when identity stops outsourcing direction to it. Reality mirrors that immediately, not symbolically, practically. Less friction, cleaner feedback, shorter loops between perception and response. This is often when people feel like they're between lives, but that implies separation. Nothing has ended. Nothing has begun. You're just no longer dragging the past version of yourself into every moment. Continuity breaks when identity stops insisting on itself. You might notice how little explanation you need now, not just from others, from yourself. You trust your internal timing more than external permission, not arrogantly, quietly. And that trust doesn't come from confidence. It comes from alignment being felt rather than pursued. If you've encountered ideas about awareness, consciousness, or reality as a mirror before, you may notice how they land differently now, not as concepts to understand, as descriptions of something already happening, something lived. That's why some words suddenly feel unnecessary, and others resonate without explanation. Recognition doesn't argue, it settles. There's a gentleness that enters here, not softness, precision. You stop forcing meaning, and meaning meets you halfway. This is also where solitude feels different, not isolating, clarifying. You don't withdraw to escape, you pause to listen. And what you hear isn't instruction, it's resonance. Listening deepens when interpretation steps aside. You may have noticed a subtle shift in how you relate to the collective. Less reactive, less absorbed. You see patterns without being pulled into them. Not superior, just centered. This is happening quietly, everywhere. Individual awakenings that don't announce themselves. No movement, no identity. Just people releasing inner tension they didn't realize they were carrying. And when enough people do that, the field changes. Not explosively, gradually, responsively. If you've ever come across parallel realities as an idea, this is where it stops being abstract. Not because you understand it, because you're living the effect of choice without force. Different outcomes, emerging naturally, because perception shifted. You're not trying to move timelines. You stopped resisting the one that fits. Paths don't open when chosen. They open when allowed. There's nothing flashy about this phase. No breakthrough moment. Just continuity without struggle. And that's why it lasts. There's nothing to wrap up here, because nothing was opened. What's been unfolding didn't begin with this video, and it doesn't end with it. It simply found a quiet place to resonate. You may notice, after this ends, that your attention doesn't snap back the way it usually does. There's a softness to how you re-enter the moment, not distracted, not absorbed, present without effort. That's often how you know something real has shifted. Not because you feel different, but because you stop checking whether you feel different. There's no insight to hold on to, no realization to protect. Anything that needs to be remembered will return on its own, without demand, without urgency. What's true doesn't need maintenance. You may find yourself later, washing your hands, walking outside, looking at nothing in particular, and notice the same quiet again, not because you recalled this moment, but because the noise didn't come back. That's when it becomes clear. You weren't waiting for direction, you were finishing a phase. And phases don't end with announcements. They end when attention relaxes. There's a subtle dignity in that. No identity upgrade, no narrative shift, no proof required. Just the absence of inner pressure where pressure once lived. If awareness is a field, then this is what happens when it stops folding in on itself. Experience spreads out. Breathing room appears. And reality responds. Not as reward, but as reflection. You don't need to do anything with this. In fact, trying would pull you out of it. This phase integrates by being lived, not referenced. Integration happens when commentary stays silent. At some point, something new will move you again. Not urgently, naturally. A direction that doesn't feel chosen, only obvious. And when that happens, you won't trace it back to this moment. You'll just move. That's how alignment works. Not loud, not convincing, accurate. If you ever come across ideas like parallel realities again, whether in a book, a phrase, or a quiet thought, you may notice how little explanation they need now, not because you understand them, because they recognize you. And recognition doesn't ask for belief. It settles where it belongs. There's no final message here, only a pause that doesn't feel empty, a silence that doesn't need to be filled. When the video ends, notice what doesn't rush back in. That's the part that matters, and it doesn't need words.